Eben, you want to know what your problem is? Diane said it, the way people say things they've been saving for a long time. You're comfortable. You have always been comfortable. And comfortable men don't build anything. Issa. She said it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night in Nashville while their daughter, Lily, sat 2 rooms away, doing homework she had already finished, pressing her pencil into the same line over and over, listening. Daniel Shaw said nothing. He was standing at the sink, still in his work clothes. Paint-spattered cargo pants, a gray thermal with a tear near the left elbow, running warm water. Over a scrape he'd caught on the scaffolding that afternoon, his hands were the kind that collected damage without drama. A deep nick above the right knuckle that had gone white at the edges. A callus on his palm, so established it had become part of the landscape of him. 8 years, Diane said. 8 years in this house, in this city, watching you patch other people's walls. You set the manila envelope on the table. The way you set something down, it's when you've already decided it isn't yours to carry anymore. It's Hussein. Marcus looked at the Atlanta proposal. He thinks it's everything I've been building toward. He wants me there by the 1st of the month. Daniel turned off the water, dried his hands with the dish towel that hung from the oven handle. The one with the faded rooster print that Lily had picked out herself at a Goodwill 2 years back, because she thought it was funny, and that Diane had never liked, and that had stayed anyway. And us, he said. Diane's chin came up slightly, the particular angle it reached when she had already rehearsed the answer and was deciding whether to use the rehearsed version or something harder. I filed last week, she said. The papers are there. I just need your signature. In the hallway. The mechanical pencil stopped moving. Daniel did not reach for the envelope. He looked at it for a moment, and then at his wife, and something in his face settled into a stillness that Diane had always read as passivity and had always despised. Lily's 11, he said, and she'll have 2 parents who are honest with each other. That's better than what we have now. He didn't argue. He had stopped arguing with Diane about the big things somewhere around year 4 when he understood that she didn't want resolution. She wanted acknowledgement that she was right, and she wasn't always wrong. She was right that he was comfortable. She was right that he did not claw or grasp or arrive home with the frantic energy of a man trying to become something. What she did not know, what he had decided a long time ago, she would never know, was why. The apartment complex on Sycamore Road, where Daniel and Lily moved 11 days later, was the kind of place that had been nice once. In a decade nobody remembered anymore. The parking lot had a crack running through it that filled with standing water when it rained. The unit on the 2nd floor had a bathroom faucet that dripped every 4 seconds, which Daniel knew because he counted it the first night, lying on a sleeping bag, while Lily slept in the only bed in the room he had painted juniper green before the boxes were even unpacked, because she had asked for green, and he had decided. Green was the first thing he could give her. He was a house painter by trade, or that was what the business cards said. Mitchell and Shaw, residential painting. The Mitchell in the name was his partner, a 53-year-old man named Gary, who chain-smoked on lunch breaks and had never learned to pronounce the word particularly correctly, and who was, in the way that mattered most, absolutely reliable. They had 42 residential contracts in the Nashville metro area. It was a real business. A decent business. Not the kind that turned heads, but the kind that paid its invoices and kept its word and returned calls. Daniel was careful to make sure it never looked like more than that. He drove a 2014 F-150 with a paint-flecked tailgate. He wore the work clothes even on the days he wasn't on site. He had a checking account with the right amount of money in it for a man in his position, and another account in another name with a number that would have confused even Diane, which is to say, even someone who thought she knew him. He set it down, but that was not the thing that kept him up at night. The thing that kept him up at night was the sound of Lily in the next room, talking to herself the way she did when she was working through something, the low, serious murmur of a child who had inherited his habit of processing silently, and her mother's urgency. And no good place to put either. He was 11. She had her mother's cheekbones and his hands. Long fingers, quick, always reaching for something to fix or make. She had started carrying a small notebook everywhere since the move, filling it with things she didn't say out loud, and Daniel had not read it, would not read it, but he noticed how thick it was getting. Next morning after, the first week on Sycamore Road, she came to breakfast with a question she'd been building to. Are we poor now? He asked it, the way a child asks something they already know the answer to, but need to hear confirmed by someone they trust. Daniel poured her orange juice, set it beside her cereal bowl. No, he said. Said Cooper. At school, said his dad, said our neighborhood is where people go when they can't afford to stay somewhere else. Cooper's dad should spend less time explaining other people's lives. He sat down across from her. Are you worried about something specific? Or just Cooper? He considered this, with the seriousness she brought to most things. He set it down. I heard Mom say you were never going to make anything of yourself. She said it plainly, not to wound him. She was too careful for that, but because she needed to know what to do with it. Fixing. Daniel looked at his daughter for a long moment. Some people, he said, measure a man by the size of his bank account. Some people measure him by what he'd blow up the bank account to protect. He picked up his coffee. You'll meet both kinds your whole life. The second kind is rarer. Try to be the second kind. Down. Lily wrote something in her notebook after breakfast. He didn't ask what. Marcus Webb had. The particular confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the room belonged to him. He wore it the way some men wear cologne, applied carefully and detectable from a distance. He was 41, managing director of Webb Capital Partners, and he had been orbiting Diane's professional life for the better part of 2 years before he began orbiting the rest of it. He was smart. That was the honest accounting of him. He was smart. He was presentable. And he had spent his 2 decades learning which rooms to be in and how to make the people in those rooms feel that his presence raised their floor. He set it down. He also had a problem that he did not yet fully understand. 6 weeks after the divorce was filed, Daniel's truck was towed from in front of the Sycamore Road complex on a Thursday morning. There was no sign, no notice. Or rather, there was a sign, but it had been turned to face the wall. The towing company, when Daniel called, named a fee. That was exactly enough to be infuriating without being enough to fight. He paid it. He noted the detail. The sign, turned deliberately, by someone who wanted him inconvenienced, but not martyred. Vandals didn't turn signs around. That was considered thought. 3 weeks later, the painting contract for the Alderton development. 48 units, 3 months of work, the largest residential job Mitchell and Shaw had ever been close to, was pulled 2 days before signing. The project manager apologized. Vague language. Another firm had submitted a revised bid. It happened. Daniel thanked him professionally and drove home and sat in the parking lot of the Sycamore Road complex for 20 minutes before going upstairs.
Sit down.
Gary called that evening. Something wrong about that Alderton thing, Gary said. I know. Bobby Reyes over there. He said they didn't pull the job because of another bid. He said someone called the developer directly. Said there were. He said the word was concerns about our operation. Jotted down what kind of concerns. Detis didn't specify. Daniel was quiet. You got a name? Gary asked. I have a theory. He didn't say the name out loud. He had learned a long time ago not to say certain names out loud on certain calls. What he understood, and what Marcus Webb had clearly not accounted for, was that a man who appeared to have nothing was a man you could push without consequence. Daniel had spent 3 years constructing that appearance carefully, brick by brick, because it was what protected Lily from the machinery of a world he had once been part of and walked deliberately away from. Marcus saw a house painter whose ex-wife had traded up and whose truck kept getting towed. He saw someone with no recourse. He was right about the house painter. He was wrong about everything else. Lily came home from school in November with a split seam on her jacket. Nasir. The left shoulder had separated from the sleeve in a way that made her hold her arm slightly in when she walked, so it wouldn't gape. She had not told him. He noticed it when she hung it by the door. How long has that been like that? He said. He lifted a shoulder. A while.
Discarcy.
Why didn't you tell me? He looked at him with an expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite self-sufficiency. And he recognized both ingredients because he had felt the same combination at her age. I didn't want you to worry, she said. He fixed the seam that night with a curved needle and upholstery thread from the kit he kept in the 3rd drawer. He was not a seamstress. The stitching was utilitarian rather than elegant, but the jacket held. He hung it back by the door before she woke up. He noticed. She didn't say anything about it directly, but at breakfast she said, unprompted, "You're pretty good at fixing things." "I'm average at fixing things," he said. "I just don't quit." She wrote that one down too. It was Diane who first asked about Marcus's backing. Not to Daniel. She had no reason to ask Daniel anything by then, but to her own attorney when certain numbers in the early projections for the Atlanta office stopped matching. Her attorney referred her to an accountant. The accountant spent 2 weeks tracing a capital line through a series of holding companies and arrived at a name that meant nothing to him, but that he flagged anyway, a Delaware-registered LLC called Anchor Lane Holdings. Diane forgot about it. She was busy. She was becoming the person she had decided to become, and becoming someone new takes all of your attention. What she did not know, what Marcus himself did not know with any confidence, was that Anchor Lane Holdings was 3 layers removed from a fund called Crestline Ventures, which was itself a subsidiary of a private investment group that managed, among many other things, a professional licensing and a professional license intellectual property portfolio of a software architecture firm that had been founded 14 years ago in Austin, Texas, by a 29-year-old named Daniel Nathaniel Shaw, who had sold his majority stake 3 years later for a number that appeared nowhere in public record, and had not appeared in public record since, and had spent the intervening years raising a daughter in relative obscurity in a city that had no particular reason to pay attention to him. He had not planned to come back. The call came in December, 2 days before Lily's winter break began. A number he recognized before he turned the phone over. His former general counsel, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had worked with him since Austin, and who was one of 4 people alive who knew the full ledger. That I wouldn't call if it wasn't real, Patricia said. I know that's what you need to hear first, so I'm saying it first. Tell me, the Crestline position. She paused. Someone's been aggregating shares through nominee accounts. Quietly, over 18 months. They're at 22%. If they hit 25, they trigger a governance clause we wrote into the original charter because we thought we'd never need it. Who's aggregating? A pause. A fund called Web Capital Partners. He was standing in the kitchen of the Sycamore Road apartment. The jackets were hanging by the door. The notebook Lily had left on the table had a small drawing on the cover, a house with a very large front porch, done in green pen. They're 3% away, Patricia said. At current acquisition pace, they'll hit it in 6 weeks. If they trigger the clause, the board has to call a structural review, which means everything that's been dormant gets surfaced. Every layer, every holding company, every name behind the name. And once that happens, I know what happens. Daniel, her voice was careful. If you do nothing, in 6 weeks, Marcus Webb will have a legal mechanism to expose every structure you built, including the ones you built to protect Lily. He was quiet, long enough that Patricia let the silence be. If I act, he said finally, then you're visible. Then it's real. Then you're not the house painter anymore. Through the thin wall, he could hear Lily's music. Something with a guitar, low and wandering. Give me 48 hours, he said. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and worked through the problem, the way he had always worked through problems. Not with urgency, but with patience, mapping the shapes of it from every angle until the solution stopped being a guess and became something he could see clearly. At 4 a.m, he got up and stood in the doorway of Lily's room the way he had stood in doorways of her rooms since she was a week old, just watching the small rise and fall of her, making sure. Tomorrow, he said softly, to the room, to himself, to a version of his life that was about to stop being possible. Tomorrow the hiding ends. He signed the papers. Patricia had prepared before the week was out. The structure unfolded exactly as she had said it would. The board triggered a voluntary disclosure, cleaner and more controlled than the alternative. And the man who had never had a public face put one on. The announcement ran on a Friday morning. A financial wire service carried it first. Crestline Ventures, majority held by a private group, whose principal was now identified as Daniel N. Shaw, had moved to block a hostile aggregation attempt by Web Capital Partners, and in doing so, had disclosed a holdings position that analysts spent the better part of the day trying to calculate accurately the number they settled on. They settled on, conservatively, placed Daniel Shaw in a category of wealth that the Nashville business press was not accustomed to writing about with local datelines. Daniel was at a job site when it broke. He was repainting the exterior of a bungalow on Belmont Boulevard because the contract was signed, and Gary had a bad knee. And Daniel did not leave things undone. His phone began going off in his pocket at 9:15 and did not stop. He finished the window trim he was working on, cleaned his brush, and drove to pick up Lily from school. Set it down. She was waiting by the front steps, backpack on, notebook in her hand. "Dad," she said, climbing in. "People are saying weird things." "What kind of weird things?" Set it down. "Cooper said his dad called you a fraud. He said you've been lying about being poor. He pulled out of the school's lot." "What do you think?" he said. He looked at him directly. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at things she was serious about. "I think you fix things and you don't quit," she said. "And I think Cooper's dad talks too much." He looked at his daughter. Something moved behind his eyes that he kept entirely off his face. "Both accurate," he said. The gala was not his idea. It was the Nashville Business Roundtable's annual dinner, something Daniel had been anonymously funding for 3 years through a donor-advised fund, and the board had decided. With the particular enthusiasm of people who understood what having him in the room would mean for everyone else in the room, to invite him as a keynote speaker. Patricia had told him to decline. His instinct was to decline. He went. Because the alternative was letting the story be told without him. And stories told without, you have a habit of getting important things wrong. He arrived alone. Black suit, no tie, the one good watch he owned, which was not new. The room's response was not the eruption of applause you might expect. It was quieter than that, and stranger. The particular silence of a large group of people simultaneously revising a story they thought they already knew. Heads turned at the entrance, and the turning spread, and conversations that had been mid-sentence stopped. In the middle of their sentences, Diane was there. Of course she was. She was there on Marcus's arm, in a dress, the color of dark plum. And she had been doing exactly what she had come to do. Being seen ascending, photographed, acknowledged, and it had been working, until the moment a current moved through the room, and every important face turned toward the door. She recognized his walk before she recognized his face. The particular unhurried quality of it, the way he moved through a crowded room, as though the crowd were incidental. Her champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. The podium. Daniel spoke for 4 minutes, without notes. He described Crestline briefly, the holding structure in plain language, the disclosure and what it meant for the acquisition attempt. He was concise. He was not warm, but he was not cold either. He was simply accurate, the way a man is accurate when he has nothing left to protect by being vague. "I've been asked," he said at the end, "why I kept it quiet for so long. Why a man would drive a 10-year-old truck and paint people's houses when he didn't have to." The room was silent. "Because I had someone to protect, and the best way I knew to protect her was to not be the person I used to be. Not because that person was bad, but because the life around that person was, and I had decided that she was worth more than the life." He stepped back from the microphone. The room responded the way rooms respond when something true has been said in a public place. Not with applause exactly, but with the full attention of everyone in it. Across the crowd, Marcus Webb had gone the color of good paper. His mind was running a calculation that kept producing the same answer. And the answer was that the capital behind his Atlanta expansion, the capital he had traced through Anchor Lane to a dormant LLC he had assumed was acquisition eligible and undefended, was not dormant, was not undefended, and the man who sat behind it was standing at the podium, 40 feet away, in the black suit, doing the math that Marcus himself had been too arrogant to do. He had not stolen from a house painter. He had tried to take from the man who was, quietly, one of the primary capital sources behind two of the PA funds that financed him. The funds that financed him. The whole of what he had built in Nashville, the reputation, the deal flow, the developer. Relationships had been built, partially, on the patient infrastructure of the man whose wife he had taken. Diane found Daniel near the bar, alone for a moment, his back to the city lights outside the tall windows. "How long?" she said. Her voice was careful, in the way of someone who has used up their steadiness. "The whole time." "The whole, Daniel, the whole time." She shook her head. "The truck, the painting, the apartment on Sycamore. You chose that. I chose Lily. The rest followed. You let me think." She stopped. Tried again. "You let me stand in our kitchen and tell you that you would never make anything of yourself. You let me say that. Is it? I didn't let you say anything, Diane. I didn't argue with you. Those are different. That's not." Her voice cracked. "You could have told me. We could have." What? His tone was not cruel. That was the thing she hadn't prepared for, the complete absence of cruelty. "You wanted a man who was going somewhere. You said that. You said it multiple times, in multiple ways. You married me and then you spent several years auditioning the man you actually wanted. What you didn't know was that the man you married had already been there, and he had already watched what being there cost someone he couldn't afford to lose." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment, and something moved in his expression, old and settled, like a scar that had become part of the face. "It means I made a choice," he said. "And you made yours. And mine was always going to be Lily." He moved past her, back into the room, and the chairman of a regional development bank intercepted him with both hands extended. And the conversation that followed involved a number that made Diane's new world look like the anteroom of the one she had been standing at the edge of the whole time and never known. Marcus tried to call in the week that followed. Daniel's attorneys were the ones who answered. The documentation that came back was precise and correct, and entirely without venom. A simple accounting of the governance clause, the disclosure requirement, the capital positions, and the options available to Webb Capital Partners, given the new reality of who it was actually dealing with. Marcus contested none of it. He had a lawyer look at every line, and the lawyer told him the same thing 3 different ways, which was that the documentation was airtight, and the man on the other side of it had apparently been in this room before and knew every door. The Atlanta deal collapsed inside of 3 weeks. The capital lines dried up in the particular way that happens when the people behind the capital have quietly decided that their patience was a gift, and the gift is being recalled. The press that had called Marcus Webb a visionary now called him A cautionary tale, which is what the press calls visionaries when the vision fails. Diane left the city by spring. Not loudly. She was too careful for that. She took the Atlanta opportunity as a solo move, stripped of Web Capital's backing and diminished in scope, and she took it because it was still something, and she had learned not to wait for everything. She called Daniel before she left. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to tell me the true answer." "Desane, all right. Did you ever love me, or was I just?" She searched for the word. Adjacent. Was I just? Someone standing close enough to fill the shape of it. He was quiet. Long enough that she thought the call had dropped.
They said,
"I loved you," he said. "I loved you the way a man loves someone when he has already closed off the part of himself that loves without reservation. Which means I gave you what I had. It just wasn't everything, and you deserved everything. I think you always knew that, and I think it's why you left, and I think you were right to." She was crying by then, quietly, on her end. "Take care of Lily," she said. "That's the only job I've ever had," he said. The fund Daniel established 3 months after established was named for a woman disclosure was named Claire, Lily's biological mother, who had died of complications from a heart condition when Lily was 4 days old, and whose face Lily had inherited, and about whom Daniel had said almost nothing to almost anyone for 11 years, because grief, real grief, doesn't narrate itself. The Claire Shaw Foundation provided tuition supplements for children from working households in 3 counties. It paid in particular attention to the kind of family that made too much to qualify for assistance and too little to actually be fine. The family in the apartment with the dripping faucet and the parking lot with the crack that filled with water. The family where a child came home with a split jacket seam and said nothing because she didn't want her father to worry. He did not put his name on the fund. He put Claire's name on it. It was the first public acknowledgement that she had existed, and it was the only monument he had ever built for her, and he built it in the only material that seemed worth using, the kind that helped people who were still alive. He bought the Sycamore Trout complex in the fall. He did not raise the rents. He fixed the parking lot crack and the faucets on the 2nd floor and the exterior stairs that had a loose railing the previous owner had been promising to repair for 4 years. He hired a property manager from the neighborhood, a woman who had 2 kids in the complex school district. In the complex's school district, and who answered her phone on weekends, and he paid her correctly. Walter Pruitt, the man who had towed Daniel's truck without proper notice, found himself, some months later, a zoning dispute that turned on a property boundary that passed through land now held by an LLC that reported, eventually, to a board that reported to Daniel Shaw. The matter was resolved without drama. Pruitt got what was fair. Daniel had stopped a long time ago, needing to win the small ones. The photographers found the story eventually. They always did. The contrast was too good. The man who had painted houses for a decade photographed once loading equipment into a truck, set beside a shareholder filing that listed him as the principal of an entity controlling several $100 million in assets. The juxtaposition did the work that no headline could quite manage. Daniel gave no interviews. He let the firm's public relations team issue a brief statement, 3 sentences, which answered exactly what it answered, and nothing more. The photographers who staked out the Sycamore Road lot. He was still there. Apartment 2B, because Lily had not wanted to move again, and he had decided she didn't have to. She didn't have to. Gave up after a week when they understood that the man was not going to perform for them. Yes, he still drove her to school himself. The car was nicer now. He'd allowed that. But he still walked her to the door when she wanted him to, which was most days, and stood at the gate until she disappeared into the building, and she still turned back once at the entrance and raised a hand, and he raised one back. On a Saturday, in March. He stood at the edge of the community garden, 2 blocks from the complex, a project a group of residents had started in an empty lot and that the previous owners of the property had been about to pave over for parking, and watched Lily help a younger child tie a tomato plant to a stake with a strip of torn t-shirt. Another parent appeared beside him. A man he'd seen at school pickups, didn't know well. The man glanced sideways. "Hey," he said. "You're I read about you, the Crestline thing." He shook his head, half laughing. "You're really out here on a Saturday morning watching a garden." Lily got the knot right. The smaller child said something, and she laughed. The real laugh, open, unguarded. The one she kept. For moments, she wasn't watching herself. Daniel raised a hand toward her. She raised one back. "Yeah," he said. The other man waited for more. It didn't come. Because Daniel Nathaniel Shaw, who had once been in every important room, who had been named in financial wire services and discussed by analysts and photographed against his will, had looked a long time ago at everything he was capable of building and chosen the one thing that couldn't be quantified and didn't need to be and couldn't be taken by someone aggregating shares through a nominee account in the dark. He had chosen her. And on a Saturday morning in Nashville, in a vacant lot, turned garden, with the spring light coming down easy through the bare trees. That choice looked exactly like what it had always been. The only one he'd never questioned, the only one that had never cost him a thing. He wasn't glad to pay. There's a moment, near the end of Daniel's story, that I keep coming back to. Not the gala. Not the financial wire running his name across every screen in Nashville. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than that. It's an 11-year-old girl with a split jacket seam, choosing not to tell her father because she didn't want him to worry, and a man who noticed anyway. Fixed it in the dark, with a curved needle and upholstery thread, and hung it back before she woke up. That's the thing nobody puts in the headline. I've watched people mistake stillness for weakness my entire life. Daniel was still. He drove the old truck, wore the paint-spattered clothes, lived in the apartment with the dripping faucet, and every person who looked at him saw a man going nowhere. What they were actually seeing was a man who had already decided where he was going, and had chosen the slowest, quietest road there because the fastest one had already cost him someone he couldn't get back. That's not passivity. That's a different kind of intelligence, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that reads a room and a person and a situation, and understands that some truths land harder when you've waited for the right moment to say them. Marcus Webb built his empire loud. He made calls, pulled strings, turned signs around in parking lots. He operated on the assumption that the man across from him had nothing, which meant he never once stopped to check whether that assumption was accurate. He didn't do the math. And the math, when it finally arrived, finished him. What Marcus lacked wasn't money or connections. He lacked the discipline to see clearly, and the integrity to act on what he saw even when it cost him something. He wanted the appearance of power more than he wanted to understand it. And that gap between what a person appears to be and what they've actually built is where most real stories happen. Think about Lily writing in that notebook, filling it, page by page, with things she was working out. She was 11 years old, already doing the thing that most adults never learn to do, sitting with hard questions instead of reaching for easy answers. She got that from her father. Not from money, not from a school, not from a neighborhood, from watching a man fix things without quitting and answer hard questions with ones that were harder and truer, and more useful. That's what I take from this story. Not the reversal, though the reversal is satisfying in the way that real justice is always satisfying. What I take is the shape of the choices. Daniel chose to be somebody to one person completely, rather than somebody to everyone, partially. He chose to be known for what he did in the dark, before anyone was watching, before there was any reason to perform it. He fixed the jacket, he fixed the shoe, he set it down. He sat on the back step in the dark with his daughter and told her the true thing, even when the true thing was heavy. The world has a way of eventually catching up to that kind of person. Not always, not on a schedule. But when it does, it tends to arrive with the full weight of everything that was quietly accumulating while nobody was looking. I don't know if Daniel Shaw would call himself a success. I think he'd say he was just a father trying to do right by his kid. But I've come to believe those two things are the same sentence, written in different ink. The strongest investment a person can make isn't in a fund or a company or a market position. It's in the small daily choice to be, in private, the person you'd want your child to grow up believing you were. Daniel made that choice every morning, and every morning it compounded.